Hey everybody, Steve Bellman here. Thanks for joining me. Hey, today I want to talk about music influence and the importance of it. So, back in the day, they had something that they called apprenticeship, which basically means that there would be somebody that maybe was a master carpenter or a master artist or master blacksmith or master plumber that had been doing it for a very long time and that had a very high skill level in whatever particular field they were in. And that as a young person, um, they would gravitate towards these people and they would become what they call their apprentice, which means that they would work with them. They would be taught by them. They would learn how these masters of whatever field they were in did things, and that they would emulate those things that they're being taught. So the same concept, I think, is good in our musical life. Even though the apprenticeship concept has kind of gone away, it's still there in different forms. So, through video, through, recordings, we can listen to people that we like and we can emulate sort of what it is that they're doing. We don't have, most of the time, we don't have the one on one contact that we would have in the normal apprenticeship sort of concept, but we still have, like I said, the recordings, learning people's solos or, the recordings of songs if we're a songwriter, learning the structure of the song and the chord progressions that they're using and so forth. So this is an important kind of way that we develop as artists. So whether you're a hip hop artist or you're a guitar player, a bass player, a songwriter, a composer, whatever you are, these influences will affect you and are very important to your growth. So there are two different kind of concepts with this apprenticeship that I'm talking about. One of them is to copy. So, let's say you're a guitar player and, um, you're a big fan of Eddie Van Halen and you want to copy everything about him and he's your only influence and you're just completely focused on his playing. You dissect everything, you know every note of his solo. Um, this could be a good thing, but it could be a bad thing. My experience is that you don't necessarily want to completely copy one person. Now, there's an exception, obviously, if you're an Elvis impersonator or you're doing some sort of impersonation as your career, then obviously this doesn't apply to you. But I'm talking about to the average musicians who want to kind of find their own voice. It's not a good idea to just focus on one person and copy them. What I would encourage more is to be influenced by them. So if you're a big Eddie Van Halen fan, certainly you want to learn his concepts and what he's doing. But I don't think you want to do it to the point where you become a clone of Eddie Van Halen because there already is or there already was an Eddie Van Halen, and you have something that's unique to offer to people, and you're not going to achieve that if you're just sounding like another person. So I'll give you an example in my own experience. Back in the 80s when I was, just developing my craft as a player and a musician, I was playing with a lot of guitar players. And at that time, most of those guitar players, not all of them, but a lot of them, who were very fine players, by the way, but a lot of them were trying to sound like Pat Metheny. So they would have the chorus pedal, they would have the same amp as Pat, maybe even the same guitar, and maybe even the same pick. And you could tell that that's pretty much all they listen to. We do Pat's music, which is obviously great, um, but there would be no originality in their playing. And I even remember hearing interviews with Pat where that was driving him nuts because I'm sure he was flattered by it, but the concept of Pat is, is to be an individual and to find your own voice. And so it wasn't necessarily a good thing for these guys to do because again, Maybe eventually they developed their own voice, but at the time they just sounded like Pat Metheny, and there was already a Pat Metheny. We didn't need to have another one. So that's the copy part of it, which I'm not a big fan of. But again, the other part would be the influential part. So if you're listening to Pat Metheny and he's influencing you, then that's good. Maybe it's a concept that he has, or maybe it's the sound, or maybe it's his writing or whatever. It could be very small things. But to be influenced by artists is a really great thing. Okay. And what I would encourage you to do is to find those artists that you're influenced by. So think of the artist that, whatever your field, that influences you the most right now. And then you're already studying what he or she is doing, obviously. Um, but go back and research who influenced that particular person. Okay. So for instance, let's say there's somebody now who is very influenced by Eddie Van Halen. He was a guitar player and he was very influenced by Van Halen. Well, that's cool. Now go back and research who Van Halen was influenced by. So maybe Jimi Hendrix. I know he was influenced by Alan Holdsworth. Find the people that influenced Eddie and then go and search them out. So check out Alan Holdsworth's work. Check out Jimi Hendrix and see what they did, because each one of those people is going to offer a different perspective. So I know with Alan Holdsworth, his influence, there was a lot of classical music influence in him. So find out who those classical artists were that influenced him and go check out that music. Now you're listening to something that you probably would never listen to before. You wouldn't know to listen to because you probably didn't know that music existed. This is the beauty of finding the people that influence you and going tracking their influences. And I would encourage you to go back 3 or 4 generations, even back to the early 1900s when, sound recording was just being made. I mean, there's a lot of music out there that's beautiful music, that's brilliant music. There's a lot of artists from the early 20s and stuff that were very influential on more modern kind of players. And so I would just encourage you to go back and to check the influencers of the ones that are influencing you. I'll give you an example in my own life. And the interesting thing about influence is that some influence is going to be bigger than others. In other words, you know, my playing now, people will listen to and maybe relate it more towards Jaco Pastorius being influenced by people like that, as opposed to this person I'm going to tell you about. So there are influencers that are going to be more apparent in your playing, but there will be also, when you do this, there will also be influencers that are in small ways influencing you in a big way. And I'll show you what I mean. So when I was like when I was 10 years old, I was blessed by my brother. I had a great brother, and I was blessed that he exposed me to really good music at an early age, even before I was playing. So, especially in the 70s, I was listening to a lot of prog music, prog rock music. So I was listening to groups like Yes, King Crimson, Gentle Giant. I was a huge fan of Giant. And then, even being influenced by some rock bands like The Who and different, Kansas, uh, bands that were producing really, really, really good music. So I was listening to that before I was even playing and at an early age. Then in my early teens, when I started playing, that music was in me. It was already in me. So I would try to, you know, imitate, the bass lines from Kansas or the group Kansas or Yes or these different groups that I had mentioned. And one of my first big influences was Chris Squire. Immediately, I was just struck by his sound, his presence, his power. His bass lines were brilliant. I still think he's one of the greatest bass players in rock music that we've ever had, and certainly influenced by Dave Hope and a guy named Ray Schulman who was in Gentle Giant. Great bass players. So early on, I was influenced a lot by more of the rock side or the prog rock side, to be more specific. When I got into high school and I started playing in the big band, the jazz band at school, um, I was listening more to, at that point, I was listening to a lot of fusion. So I was listening to Return to Forever, Mahavishnu Orchestra, and then obviously towards the later part of my high school years, I started listening to Jaco Pastorius and Weather Report and the influence of that music. That was huge on me at that point. And like I said, I was in the jazz band, so I was being exposed to big band music as well. So I was listening to Buddy Rich Band, um, Louis Bellson, all the big bands of that point of in the 70s and the 80s. I was listening to a lot of that music. So jazz was starting to creep in, but it was still more on the fusion side for me. When I got into college, that's where I started listening to more jazz, so more traditional jazz. So I was really influenced by John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, Bill Evans. I mean, Charles Mingus, the list. Oh, Thelonious Monk was a huge influence. The list would go on and on. So at that point, I didn't forsake the progressive thing. It's not that I started to hate it or anything, but it wasn't on the forefront of what I was doing. And for most of my career, it's been more on the improvisational side when I'm creating music, less on the progressive side. If you listen to the Odd Dogs music, there is some progressive music that came out later on. But for the most part, I've been mostly influenced by the fusion side of it, the jazz side of it. So when people hear me play, it's going to be more on the Jaco Pastorius side as opposed to the Chris Squire side. So as I went on, this I started thinking about this, and it's actually started bothering me. It's like, how could Chris Squire be such an important part of my life, my early musical life, and I don't sound like him. I don't play like him. I don't use a pick. I don't play the music that he plays. It was almost like disappointing to realize that this person had been such an influence on my life, but there's no representation necessarily of him in me, and it sort of bummed me out a little bit. And then I started thinking, and there was an element that I took from Chris. And again, this is not the obvious one. So the obvious one is when I'm soloing or playing, you're going to hear Stanley Clarke or influences of Jaco Pastorius because I'm more of that kind of player. This was more subtle, but not less important. So what I figured out is with Chris, the thing I loved about Chris is if you took his bass lines out of the Yes songs, you would not have a song. The song would not be the same. So I give you examples. I mean, it's all throughout the music, but I give you examples of Roundabout, which was on the Fragile album. If you listen to that song, you listen to the bass line. The sound is amazing. The drive is amazing, but his part is amazing. And it's not only rhythmically there, it's harmonically there, and it's melodically there. You take that bass line out, and the song is completely diminished. Um, Another song is from an album that not too many people are familiar with, but it's an album called Relayer. And again, it's Yes. And it's a song called Sound Chaser. That song is an amazing tune. It's one of the greatest examples of the use of bass melodically out there. Incredible song. And you take his bass part out of it, you don't have a song. It's not the same. That's a concept that I've always tried to use. And I'm not saying I've used it as well as Chris because nobody's at that level. Chris was one of a kind. But it's always been the thing that I've tried to accomplish, whether it's my music or somebody else's music, whether it's complex part or it's simple part. I've always tried to create my bass lines in a way that if you took them away, it would diminish the song. So if you listen to any of the Odd Dogs material, you'll hear that the bass lines are pretty prominent in all those songs. They're melodically prominent, they're rhythmically prominent, and even in the mix, they're prominent. That was the same with Chris, as he was up in the mix. It wasn't in the background. So that was something that I realized that was, to me, I didn't, to me, I thought, like, where is Chris's influence in my playing? It doesn't make any sense. But when I thought about that, I thought, man, that's huge, because that's a huge part, even though it's a small element that in terms of people wouldn't be able to connect it, you know. Oh yeah, his bass lines are like they'd probably never connect that. But so it's insignificant in a sense, but in another sense it's huge, because that's a big part of what I've tried to do, especially in my creative process. Whether I'm creating a song or I'm creating a bass line for a song, that's a huge part of what I try to do, and it just was something I didn't realize. So what am I trying to say with all this? I'm trying to say that if you get a lot of different influences and from a lot of different backgrounds, then you're going to have some influencers that are bigger, that are more obvious, but you're also going to have those influencers that maybe are smaller in terms of the to be able to identify them, but they're going to be huge in the sense that they're going to help to shape who you are as a player. And I think of it as like a gumbo or a nice soup, man. You get all these different influences. Like, you know, like I said, Chris Squire has nothing to do with Charles Mingus, or, you know, Hank Williams as a songwriter was an influence. It's like you get those three people together, you put them in a soup. That's an unusual combination, because there's no connection between the three of those people except music. But when you stir that in your little gumbo pot of music influence, and then you incorporate your interpretation of music and your spirit and your soul with that, that's when you start to find a unique voice, and you start to find your individual voice. So, um, so what I would say, the takeaways with this are the people that are influencing you directly right now the most. I would say, um, again, find out who influenced them and start going back and doing research on those particular other people. And hopefully that will bring you into a lot of different arenas of music, because the diversity of music is important as well, because it'll come out in a unique way. Then, you know, those influencers then take that and incorporate that into your own music and let it come out in your own music. And don't be a copier of somebody, but be influenced by multiple people. So again, if you like a specific person, that's fine. You can learn that person's style or whatever, but don't limit it to that. Don't just copy that person. Let that person influence you, and then find the people that were connected to them, and let those people influence you as well. And that again will help you to find what we call your musical voice, and it will be something original. It'll be something slightly different. Okay? All right. Thank you guys for listening. I hope this helped. I hope it blessed you. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks a lot. Take care.